Everyone, welcome to the video for module 10.1. Here we're going to go over some of the brief, just an introduction into the autonomic nervous system, and we'll get a little bit more in depth into that as we get into 10.2.1 and 10.2.2. As always, you can see the learning objectives listed here. So again, recall that our previous discussions on the divisions of the nervous system here. We can talk about the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord. And we also have the peripheral nervous system, or the PNS, which is the cranial and spinal nerves. And within those are the sensory division, which detects stimuli both internal and external, and the motor divisions, which respond to stimuli by movements by the muscles or by secretions by the glands. Within those two, you have the somatic nervous system, which responses that are voluntary, and the autonomic nervous system, and that responses are involuntary and is sometimes called the general visceral motor system. And in this chapter, we'll discuss some of the components of the autonomic nervous system, and we'll start by comparing the characteristics of the somatic nervous system to the autonomic nervous system. So some of the characteristics of the somatic nervous system. The effectors or the target organs are the skeletal muscles. The efferent pathways and ganglia are cell bodies of the motor system are in the central nervous system, and their axons extend into the spinal nerves all the way to the skeletal muscles. These also utilize neurotransmitters and their effect. So acetylcholine is released in the synaptic cleft via the neuromuscular junction, where it always excites or stimulates the fibers to contract, and the amount of myelination. So neurons are highly myelinated in this section. So some of the characteristics of the autonomic nervous system, their effectors or target organs are the cardiac muscle, the smooth muscle, and the glands. The effector pathways in the ganglia. The motor units of the ANS is a 2-neuron chain. So the cell body in the first neuron, the preganglionic neuron, resides in the brain of the spinal cord. Its axon, the preganglionic axon, synapses with the second motor neuron called the postganglionic neuron in the autonomic ganglion outside the CNS. And the axon of the postganglionic neuron, so the postganglionic axon, extends to the effector organ. Some of the neurotransmitters that it uses, the preganglionic neurons always use acetylcholine, but the postganglionic neurons use either acetylcholine or adrenaline. And within those, we have norepinephrine and epinephrine. So the effect varies according to the target tissues and can be stimulatory or inhibitory. And then acetylcholine, and again, affects various, again, its effect varies according to target tissues and can be stimulatory or inhibitory. Also, the amount of myelination, talking about this, the preganglionic neurons are lightly myelinated, while postganglionic neurons are unmyelinated. So let's consider the two divisions of the autonomic nervous system here. So we have the sympathetic, or the fight or flight, or the parasympathetic, which is the rest and digest, or the feed and breed. Action via the ANS is dual innervation. So in other words, the two divisions counterbalance each other's activities in the attempt to maintain homeostasis. These two divisions are separated on the basis of three characteristics. Their origin of the fiber, so the parasympathetic fibers originate in the cranial and sacral regions of the spinal cord. The sympathetic fibers originate in the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord. The relative lengths of their fibers, so the parasympathetic has long preganglionic and short postganglionic, and sympathetic has short preganglionic and long postganglionic, and the location of their ganglia. So and the parasympathetic is located in the visceral effector organ or near it, and the sympathetic is located near the spinal cord in a chain of ganglia called the sympathetic trunk. So again, we already talked about some of the nicknames. The parasympathetic is the feed and breed, or rest and digests, or can be classified by the 3 Ds of digestion, defecation, and diuresis. And then the sympathetic is the fight or flight, and by the 4 Es, excitement, emergency, embarrassment, and exercise. The neurotransmitters that affect these, we already touched on that briefly, but again, the parasympathetic uses acetylcholine at both synapses, and the sympathetic utilizes acetylcholine in the first synapse, but epinephrine or norepinephrine in the second synapse. So in the sympathetic nervous system, which is also called the thoracolumnar division, because of the preganglionic fibers of the sympathetic division arise from all cell bodies of the preganglionic neurons located in the spinal cord segments from T1 to L2. It is more complex in the parasympathetic division because it innervates more organs, which are both visceral and somatic, And synapses within the paravertebral or the sympathetic chain ganglia. The postganglionic neurons enter the ventral ramus of the adjoining spinal nerves by way of the white ramus comminations. And from there, they travel via branches of the rami and ascend upward to the head, forming the superior cervical ganglion. And that stimulates muscles of the iris to dilate, distant focusing. It also inhibits nasal and salivary glands, stimulates copious sweating, stimulates the erector pili muscles, so it gives you those goosebumps, causes blood vessels to vasodilate, and provides branches to an oxygen sensor in the carotid, the larynx, and the pharynx. And it also travels to the middle cervical ganglion and the inferior cervical ganglion, or the stellate ganglion. And that innervates the heart to increase heart rate and blood pressure, dilates the aorta, dilates the bronchioles, and constricts the esophageal sphincter. So synapses in the collateral ganglia. So those fibers enter and leave through the white ramus communicans without synapsing. And instead, the preganglionic fibers of T5 through L2 synapse in the collateral ganglia outside of the sympathetic trunk. They also form several nerves collectively called the thoracic splenic nerves. And these are the greater, the lesser, and the least, and the lumbar and sacral splenic nerves. The splenic nerve synapse at the abdominal aortic plexus and clings to the surface of the abdominal aorta. Synapses occur at ganglia of the plexus. These are the thoracic splenic nerve, or the celiac ganglia, which innervates the stomach, the adrenal medulla, the liver, the kidneys, and the intestines, and the superior mesenteric ganglion, which innervates the small intestine. And we also have the lumbar and the sacral splenic nerves, and within those, the inferior mesenteric ganglion innervates the rectum, and the hypogastric ganglion, which innervates the bladder and the genitalia. So neurons from the lateral horn of the spinal cord project into the chain ganglia on either side of the vertebral column, and are anterior to the vertebral column in the abdominal cavity. And these axons form preganglionic neurons, postganglionic neurons, and then project to the target effectors throughout the body. And there are a few effects of the sympathetic. We already talked about a little bit of these, but they help to dilate the pupils, inhibits secretion of digestive glands, stimulates sweating, stimulates the erector pili, stimulates the adrenal medulla, increases heart rate and BP. It also increases several digestive processes and kidney function, such as urine output, causes the ejaculation, and stimulates glyconeogenesis in the liver, and helps blood vessels to constrict or dilate depending on what you need to do. So talking about the parasympathetic division here, which is also called the craniosacral division because of the origin of the nerves. And we can talk a little bit about the outflow here, specifically in some of the nerve innervations. So in the oculomotor nerve, it innervates smooth muscles through the eyes and causes the pupils to constrict and the lens to bulge. And in the preganglionic axons found in the oculomotor nerves, issues from the midbrain, while cell bodies from the ganglionic neurons are in the ciliary ganglia within the eye orbits. We also talk about the facial nerve, which is nerve 7. That stimulates many of the large glands in the head, so the nasal, the lacrimal, and some of the salivary. And these preganglionic fibers from the lacrimal nuclei and the pons synapse in the pterogangliopon ganglia. And this innervates both the nasal and the lacrimal glands, stimulating tear production and nasal secretions. And the postganglionic or the preganglionic fibers from the superior salivatory nuclei of the pons synapse with the submandibular ganglia and innervate the submandibular and sublingual salivary glands to stimulate the release of saliva. In the glossopharyngeal nerve, or nerve 9, this innervates the parotid salivary gland and stimulates the release of saliva. And preganglionic fibers from the inferior salivatory nuclei of the medulla will synapse in the otic ganglia located within the walls of the target organ. And finally, the vagus nerve, or nerve 10. Preganglionic fibers from the dorsal motor nuclei of the medulla will synapse in several terminal ganglia located in the walls of the target organ. And these terminal ganglia are collectively called the intramural ganglia. And some of the effects of the intramural ganglia It can affect the heart, so it can decrease or steadies the heart rate and constrict the coronary veins and arteries. In the lungs, it constricts the bronchioles. In the liver and the gallbladder, it expels bile. In the stomach, it stimulates secretions of the enzymes and increases contraction and motility. In the pancreas, it will stimulate insulin secretion. And in the intestine, it will increase motility or peristalsis. Here you can see the same thing for parasympathetic innervation and some of the effects of the parasympathetic. So remember, this is the D division, the digest, defecate, and diuresis. So the pupils will constrict. It also stimulates salivary, lacrimal, and pancreas glands. It'll decrease heart rate and BP. It'll cause emptying of some of the hollow organs. It'll cause vasodilation of the penis or an erection. And it is minimal on the blood vessels and the bronchioles. So some of the competing arc reflexes, the postganglionic fibers of the sympathetic and parasympathetic division both release neurotransmitters that bind to the receptors on their targets. Postganglionic sympathetic fibers release norepinephrine with a minor exception, where postganglionic fibers such as the superior cervical ganglion stimulate the muscles to the iris to dilate. Whereas postganglionic or parasympathetic fibers release ACH. And depending on the neurotransmitter and its corresponding receptor, this will create different reactions within the body. And examples of this are heart rate, where epi and norepi will increase heart rate and ACH will slow the heart rate, and the iris control, where low light stimulates the sympathetic to release epi and norepi to contract the iris smooth muscles and dilate the pupil, and bright lights will stimulate the parasympathetic to release ACH, which will contract the smooth muscles in the iris and constrict it to shrink. You can see some of that here. So talking a little bit about some of the reflexes. Reflexes are rapid autonomic responses to specific stimuli, and reflexes preserve homeostasis by making rapid adjustments in the function of the organs or the organ systems. And there are 5 steps in a typical reflex arc. So 1, a receptor cell will detect the stimulus. 2, the receptor relays the stimulus to a sensory organ in the afferent branch. 3, the sensory neuron will relay this information to the interneurons, or the association neurons, located within the CNS, so the brain and the spinal cord, for integration. 4, the interneurons stimulate a motor neuron, which in turn carries signals to the CNS, or the efferent branch. And then 5, the motor neuron innervates an effector cell of the body to generate the appropriate response to the stimulus. So the nature of these responses are that somatic reflexes are involuntary control of the skeletal muscle, and visceral reflexes are autonomic control of smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands, or adipose tissue. In the afferent branch, visceral receptors located throughout the body, and examples of this would be special mechanoreceptors called baroreceptors that sense pressure found in the aorta. And conscious perception of visceral pain can sometimes display in irregular locations that's called referred pain. In the efferent branch of the visceral reflex arc begins with the projection from the central neuron along the preganglionic fiber, and this fiber then makes a synapse on the ganglionic neuron that projects to the target effector, such as the eye, the bladder, and the reproductive organs. Short reflexes are completely peripheral and only involves the location of the integration of the sensory input with motor output. And in long reflexes, has afferent branches that enter the spinal cord or brain and involve the efferent branches. Here we talk a little bit about pupillary size, and we highlighted this a little bit earlier, but this is another brief overview of that. So some of the neurotransmitters and their receptors. Acetylcholine and norepinephrine are the major neurotransmitters that are released by the ANS. So acetylcholine is released by all ANS preganglionic axons, all parasympathetic postganglionic axons, and both of these types of axons are called cholinergic fibers. And most sympathetic postganglionic axons release norepi and are classified as androgenic fibers. So some of the cholinergic receptors that bind ACH were named based on drugs that mimic acetylcholine. So nicotine receptors, or nicotinic receptors, are found on all ganglionic neurons, the adrenal medullary cells, and the skeletal muscles. And muscarinic receptors These are found on all parasympathetic target organs and select sympathetic organs, so the eccrine, sweat glands, and the blood vessels of the skeletal muscle. And when ACH binds to nicotinic receptors, it is always stimulatory. However, when ACH binds to mucineric receptors, it may stimulate or inhibit according to the target tissue. Androgenic receptors are represented by two major classes that bind either epinephrine or norepinephrine. We have alpha located in the blood vessels serving the skin, the mucosa, the visceral organs, the kidneys, the salivary glands, and all sympathetic organs except the heart, and the beta, which are located within the heart and the coronary blood vessels, the kidney, the liver, the adipose tissue, the lungs, and many other sympathetic target organs. So when norepi or epi bind to the alpha androgenic receptors, it is generally stimulatory, while binding to the beta androgenic receptor is generally inhibitory. And these are definitely exceptions to the rule. So the beta-1 androgenic receptors of the heart are usually stimulatory rather than inhibitory, like other classes of beta receptors. And this is just a breakdown here in chart form. So some of the drugs that influence this, atropine is an anticholinergic drug that blocks parasympathetic effects and is routinely administered to prevent salivation, cause pupil dilation, and to dry up respiratory secretions. Neogestamine inhibits acetylcholinesterase, and therefore ACH accumulates in the synapse and the muscle contraction is impaired. Albuterol dilates the bronchioles. Ephedrine is a sympathetic mimicking drug that stimulates alpha androgenic receptors, and beta blockers are drugs that inhibit the cardiac beta-1 androgenic receptor, and these help to reduce heart rate and arrhythmias without disrupting some of the sympathetic effects.